Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us on AJC Europe Connect. Today's discussion will focus on the issue of democracies in light of coronavirus, an issue of deep concern for AJC, which as a non-partisan advocacy organization has been at the forefront of the defense of democratic values around the globe. Since the coronavirus pandemic erupted, leaders in the democratic world have used extensive powers as an immediate response to what constitutes a global health crisis. These measures, going from travel bans to containment orders and closures of businesses, can be seen as tests on democratic governments' commitment to liberties and civil rights. In some cases, whether the crisis has been used as an opportunity to advance a political agenda has even been questioned. In other parts of the world, propaganda and opacity have been at play, with dire impacts. Not only authoritarian regimes have disregarding the needs of their populations, but their way of dealing with the crisis has been disruptive in many aspects at the global level. In order to address these important issues, it is our absolute pleasure to be joined today by our panelists. Mr. Daniel Kaddik, who is the Executive Director of the European Liberal Forum, Dr. Alan Mendoza, who's the Executive Director of the Henry Jackson Society, Mrs. Corina Rebeggia, who's the Director of the US-Romania Initiative at the Center for European Policy Analysis, and Edith Gut, lecturer at the University of Warsaw, fellow at the German Marshall Fund, and fellow at Visegrad Insight. Our panelists will share their views and help us understand whether the political implications created by the coronavirus crisis could affect the state of democracies around the world. They will be in conversation with Simone Rodin, Director of AJC Europe. After having heard from our panelists, we will take your questions. You may email your questions at paris@ajc.org or by using the Q&A chat featuring Zoom. Simone, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Julie. Good afternoon to you here in Europe, and good morning for those who are joining us from the United States. It is my honor and my pleasure to be moderating today's Europe Connects program with indeed such distinguished panelists. As Julie just mentioned, AJC has indeed been strongly invested in the safeguarding of democratic values over basically decades. So this topic is really particularly important to us, knowing that crises generally can always have an impact on these issues we care about. So let me dive in right away. Alan, if I can start out with you. We have seen all of our countries basically in lockdown with emergency measures being taken in order to save lives. Are you concerned about some of the long-term consequences for our individual liberties and for our democratic values? And how can we strike really the right balance between, on the one hand, the need to save lives, protect in particular the most vulnerable, and on the other, the need to protect our individual liberties?
Well, thank you, Simone, and it's a great pleasure to be with the AJC community and my fellow panelists today. Look, I think you framed the discussion point very well. We have here an extraordinary situation, a situation which you'd have told us 2 months ago that would be happening in our society. We'd all have laughed and gone, what is that all about? The reality is that we are living in an unprecedented time on a health crisis area. But as you've quite rightly pointed out, it has huge repercussions for civil liberties, for economics, for all sorts of things in society, far beyond simply health aspects of this particular crisis. And I think the most obvious point of conflict going forwards is going to be the balance, as always, between what our governments need to know, what they should know, what they must know, and what they don't really need to know, but they want to know, if that makes any kind of sense in the discussion point. And where I think we've looking at this very carefully is, of course, in the concept of technology being used to track and trace, as we're now seeing across the world. And we're fully aware that the virus needs monitoring post-lockdown, and in fact, the only way we can be reasonably safe in the idea of reducing a lockdown is if we have some way of tracking and tracing. But I think there is a big divide between how certain countries are going to operate this track and tracing and others. It would seem that countries like Britain, for example, are going to go very much into the centralized government control of the information. So it'll all go into a centralized server where you've been moving around, potentially you've been seeing all that sort of activity. Other countries will go for a much looser approach when it comes to phones talking to phones. The idea, of course, being if you end up having symptoms, you will be, people who've been in contact with you will be contacted. Now, we can obviously, all of us can see the health benefits. All of us want to be out of lockdown. But I think the first question we have to ask is how much information should the government be having at any sort of point about all of our activities? And also, how long should it be allowed to keep that information for? Because all of these can be used, to sort of punish citizens or to say, well, we think you've been doing X and Y, you shouldn't have been doing X and Y, we're going to punish you as a result. So I think that's the immediate aspect there. But of course, we can go into a lot of the other angles as well on impact on society, how, for example, social distancing will change our lives, how our economies are going to be damaged by this. And I think I'm presuming we'll cover that during the course of the discussion.
Yes, we certainly will. But by the way, don't hesitate at some point to just, jump in if there's something that you want to mention. Thank you very much, Alan. Daniel, if I can continue maybe with you and speak specifically about the danger of the crisis that it could potentially pose to the European Union. Many have argued that the initial response by the European Union was slow. Some have said that it was far too slow. EU Commission President Ursula von der Leyen actually recently apologized to Italy for having abandoned it in the beginning of the crisis. Now, believe in a very recent poll, the Italians were polled and they were asked whether they believe that the European Union is actually in their advantage. And if I'm not mistaken, it was about 67% of Italians said they believed it wasn't in their advantage. Do you think this crisis could be the straw that sort of breaks the camel's back? Could it be the end, really, of the European Union?
Well, thank you, first of all, for this fantastic question, or these fantastic questions, and of course, AJC for the invitation. And when I was listening to you, I was thinking about my own contemplations about the topic of today, whether or not coronavirus is a challenge to liberal democracies, question mark. I think we can put a solid exclamation point behind that, and also to the question of a threat to the EU as such. And mostly because what we have seen as threats already to the European Union and liberal democracies, we see that now on speed. Now with the nationalisms coming to the forefront, be it economic nationalism or factual nationalism that is coming out saying, oh, nobody's helping us, we need to be strong as a nation, which unfortunately you see more and more. That combined with the overall liberties that we find on lockdown, being it media, communication, travel, privacy. And then the question is, what kind of leadership can we see? What kind of leadership do we expect? And in a situation where there's an imminent threat or a perceived imminent threat, people usually tend to go for a stronger leadership style. And then if the big entity, that is the European Union, is not able to find solutions fast, and as you said rightly, Ursula von der Leyen had to apologize for that. If there is no collaboration, that has been the big thing that everybody said, that's why we need the European Union in the first place, because we need this European collaboration. But when we see that it's broken, when we see that the economic nationalism is going forward, the borders are closed, that the question of who helps his or her economy the strongest is on the forefront, we have to ask the questions if the European Union can survive that, especially, and that would be my last point of that. Ivan Krastev wrote a very interesting book that he presented last year about how liberalism became the god that failed in Eastern Europe especially. And if you look at the new EU member states, there is an increased threat that these cracks that we have seen over the years with the financial crisis, with the migration crisis, with Brexit, another crisis with the virus, widens the cracks so much that if we do not have proper answers, both from an institutional but also crisis response standpoint, that we have a long-term problem and that the EU is indeed under threat.
Sorry, my sound was off. Sorry, you just mentioned rightfully a certain part in the region, in particular Central Europe. You also mentioned the fact that this, to some extent, is revealing an already pre-existing problem. So Edith, if I might speak to you now and basically ask you sort of to follow up on what Daniel just said, really focusing on Central Europe. Do you think that there is a danger that anti-European feeling in the population will grow? Central Europe was always a part of Europe where there was a certain pro-European feeling. But where do you see this going now? Do you see this crisis as revealing potentially an anti-European feeling, an also liberal democracy feeling? How does it operate? And also maybe if you can try it, sort of how can it be countered?
Thank you very much, Simon. And I would also like to thank the organizers to have me. I'm very happy to be here. So follow up on what has been said by Daniel. In particular, our region, Central Eastern Europe, is a very peculiar kind of sort of like a package of countries, because while we are the most pro-European, we are at the same time electing the most sort of most Eurosceptic and illiberal governments, and it's reflecting upon many kind of social attitudes and preconditions. But before I dive into that, what I wanted to mention is that, as it has been said by Daniel, this pandemic is a perfect storm to fire up anti-EU sentiments. And because the EU is an easy target, blaming for its incompetence and sort of inactions, it provides many practical sort of advantages. It alleviates some responsibilities from the national governments, and it's also scapegoating might help to resonate with all the electorate that are really desperate to find answers in times of sort of uncertainty and this kind of crisis situations. So speaking of the social preconditions, I think what's need to be taken into account here is that what has been very successfully exploited by especially the Polish and the Hungarian governments is that anti-establishment sentiments has been used against the EU. So these governments were directed, sort of channeled at anti-establishment frustrations towards the European Union, which is ironically not in sort of conflict with pro-EU member attitudes, because there is a very strong consensus among the society that we need the European Union mainly for economic reasons. So speaking about how is it possible that we are pro-European and at the same time we are voting for Eurosceptic governments? First of all, this region has been serving as a sort of early warning system for the West, where there is a very low level of interpersonal trust and low level of social capital and a very low level of trust within democratic institutions. And these are all favorable sort of background for a Eurosceptic and an illiberal sort of turn in the region. So if you had a look at the numbers, Gallup International Poll has been already predicted in 2007 that the societies in Central and Eastern Europe are the most skeptical about state of democracy, and only about 1/3 trusted democratic procedures. And also ordinary people are being depicted as losers of the democratic transition, the time when most important geopolitical goal was to join the European Union. And leftist parties have been sort of losing their credibility within the working class. So this is how Eurosceptic right-wing parties could fill in the gap. And this is how Fidesz and Law and Justice could successfully depict the democratic transition as a failure, and how they could build a vision about a new type of democracy that we need, and sort of the corrected transition that is needed. So, so this is how they could successfully appeal those who felt that they were left behind, and this is how it's easier to channel the frustration towards the European Union at the end of the day.
or with the same problem, sorry. So Karina, you are based in the United States, but you come from Europe. You work on both continents, with both continents. I would like to try and sort of see if you could give us a little bit of an insight. We spoke about Europe. We spoke about generally how the issue affects democracies, how it affects part of the region in Europe. But from your perspective, how would you assess sort of the, let's call it, democratic resilience, both in Europe and the United States? From your perspective, have there been differences, and how does it play out?
Thank you, Simone, and it's good to be part of this conversation. I think what this crisis has exposed is actually more fundamental weaknesses in our systems of democratic governance. And the way I look at this crisis is more in terms of whether it confirms a trend or is just a momentary pause in what we thought our values, our principles, our systems are supposed to be doing. And it was interesting, if you follow the Varieties of Democracies project from Sweden, they've been tracking what they call the third wave of autocratization, and that's a depreciation of democratic governance all over the world. And they also looked in particular at how the emergency measures, for instance, in the context of coronavirus, have affected democracies around the world. And the numbers look pretty problematic, with 48 countries with a high risk of democratic decline during the pandemic, and 34 countries at medium risk. A lot of these countries are actually in what we would call the Western world, or the transatlantic space. So I think while we're used to keep the focus on Central and Eastern Europe, I think the trend of weakening democratic institutions can be observed all throughout the Western world as well. But in particular for Central and Eastern Europe, I think it's also a difference in expectation. And I think the previous speakers have alluded to that we used to have an aspirational value to the democratic trajectory of these countries. There was NATO integration, there was EU integration, and now there seems to be a massive rollback on how these governments have been actually implementing true transformation in a democratic sense. So just to sum it up here, when I think of democratic resilience, I think about what these emergency measures are actually doing. So the emergency measures are supposed to take us through this crisis and preserve the democratic values and the democratic institutions. They're not supposed to weaken them. And I think what we've seen in some of the countries in Central and Eastern Europe in particular, but not only, is actually an attempt to grab more power, to consolidate executive overreach, to silence voices, to weaken the rule of law and the checks and balances, and even to target certain communities and do racial profiling. I think we've seen that in Hungary, in Bulgaria, and in other countries. And that's problematic. And I think the question we need to ask is how we come out of this crisis. Are we going to see a return to a system of governance that respects the rights and freedoms and participation, and allows alternative voices and true expression of the variety of opinions in society? Or we're going to see a further depreciation and consolidation of some of these emergency measures. And also I would alert us to think about how these weaknesses or governance gaps are being exploited by malign foreign actors. And this crisis has been a perfect illustration of how penetrable and how vulnerable our systems actually are to malign foreign influence and to adversarial campaigns. And this is something to watch for in the near future, because these campaigns are likely to intensify and not roll back. And second, again, what will happen once, let's say, we plateau the curve and we start to go back to whatever the new normal is going to be, whether we will be able to withstand the waves of protests and dissatisfaction and sort of unrest among citizens as a result of the economic crisis and everything that comes with it. So we should be bracing ourselves and thinking about how we build that resilience within our societies to actually withstand that. And whether we can support the forces in societies that have helped keep all of these countries in line with democratic principles. And I'm thinking about civil society. Is there going to be an appetite for funders to continue to invest in civil society work? And is there going to be an appetite for, among their constituencies, among the public, for civic action, but also for just interest in politics? And I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Corina. I'll ask one more question afterwards, but I will definitely come back to the whole idea about about other state actors and destabilization efforts. But maybe just sort of as an interlude, just before Daniel, if I can maybe turn to you and specifically speak to some of those sort of non-democratic actors. Joseph Borrell, the current High Representative of the European Union, recently said in an interview that Europe had been, and I quote, somewhat naive vis-a-vis China. Do you think this is an accurate description? And what do you see happening with regards to Europe's relationship to China? There have been different approaches when you compare Europe's approach to China and the US's approach to China. Where do you see this heading? We can't hear you. Daniel?
I have another button. So I said that I have a slight problem with this notion of being naive. You can only claim to be naive so many times. We have had quite a lot of discussions about China in the past when it came to economic espionage, economic problems, 16+1, and so on and so forth. So really thinking that China is playing by the same rules as we do, and just because we play nice, China will also play nice, that is indeed a bit naive. Or if it happens more than once, you can find a different placeholder word that's a little bit stronger. In general, if you look at the external actors, they have become indeed a problem in the European Union. Being it Russia, being it China, with additional spread of disinformation. I mean, we have a special unit for that in the European Union, in the institution that deals with disinformation, especially coming from Russia. But there is a very weird perpetuum mobile that's going, or seems to be going on. There is some outside information that's coming in distorted, and then there is the inside forces that have been there for quite a while, and they're getting ever faster in the shrillness of what is being discussed, being it about the origin of the coronavirus, economic problems, about how we are lied to, and these kind of things. But just quickly back to China. Europe really needs to think how they want to deal with China. We have had the discussions in the European Parliament and the European institutions that we needed a stronger stance about it. There have been discussions about making the European economy more resilient to Chinese influence. And there, as a European liberal, I'm in a bit of a tight spot. On the one hand, I'm very in the Bastia tradition, I'm saying that we should allow as much free trade as possible. On the other side, maybe the American more hawkish tradition or approach to China is also not too bad at the moment. We need to strike a balance where we do not take our own values to a place where they shouldn't be. So we need to uphold our values by showing resilience. But this is indeed a very tight spot, especially for Europeans. And again, another problem for the Europeans, whilst the Americans can speak with one voice, we have 27 voices that are speaking, plus the Commission, which makes it ever harder to find a common line towards China and the influence that's coming from there. Again, 16+1 being the perfect example of that.
Thank you, Daniel. Corina, I wanted to go back to the issue both of you mentioned of disinformation campaigns of external actors. All of this has been going on, of course, before the crisis. It's only intensified. Again, you mentioned China, you mentioned Russia. You can certainly also mention Iran, specifically with relations to anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. Where is this going? And maybe a step further, what can we do to protect ourselves?
It's the million-dollar question right there. And there is no unique response. And I think, as you mentioned, we have been alerted to how these hostile actors have been operating in our information space, at least since 2014, when after the annexation of Crimea and the start of the war in eastern Ukraine, when Russia has intensified its operations in the transatlantic space. And I think our sort of machinery of responding, both in terms of, in tactical, operational terms, but also in more, in our strategic thinking about it, has been very slow. And I think some of the good things that we are doing, we need to continue to be doing, but I think we kind of need to speed up our game because, as you mentioned, other actors are flooding this space as well. And I think what this crisis has revealed is how China is now operating globally, and its strategy is changing. So China used to use the propaganda machine more to attain its domestic goals. So it had some political internal consolidation goals that it needed to achieve. It had to do with Taiwan, it had to do with Hong Kong, and it had to do with some of its economic expansion goals. And this was very clear on how China was operating to advance these objectives. Now, I think we're seeing more of the Russian behavior in the online space with spreading disinformation and conspiracies, and this way of amplifying content and spreading it further as being mimicked by China. And China is turning propaganda and disinformation more into a foreign policy tool. And this is something we need to be more alert about. And I think this needs to be part of the transatlantic conversation. So US, EU member states, EU as a supranational body as well. And I think it is going to be a test for the resilience, or for the cohesion of the alliance. And that comes in with sort of two implications. One, something that has come up in both China's and Russia's disinformation campaigns during the coronavirus pandemic so far, is that they're promoting a different system of governance and depicting it as being more effective in dealing with crisis, right? So the authoritarian model, and I think Daniel has referenced that in his introductory remarks, that people in times of crisis, there seems to be a preference for stronger leadership. And these two actors are really speculating on the fear and anxiety of the pandemic to promote a different system, an alternative system that is depicted as being better. And second, they've been very good at also speculating the divides between the Europeans and the US. So when it comes to responses, and Daniel talked a little bit about that, I think they need to be thought more in an ecosystem type of thinking. I think we've been focusing on how to knock down trolls and bot accounts and bot networks and all that. I think we need to look at the broader system. We need to look at economic penetration. We need to look at rule of law and corruption, and how, for instance, illicit money flows actually allow these actors to operate in our democratic spaces. We need to look at political undue influence. And this is what creates the permissive environment where information campaigns can actually gain more ground.
Thank you very much. Alan, if I can ask you maybe to react to that, and also specifically, Corina just mentioned the fact that particularly at the beginning, there was really sort of, both Corina and Daniel mentioned the fact that there was a sort of a lot of movement going on the social media and in the media about how China and other autocratic regimes were actually dealing better with the coronavirus crisis. So do you think there is a sort of a danger of an autocratic temptation, if we may say so? And also if you want to react to some of what has been said before.
Well, yes, we can deal with that in two ways. Look, have autocratic states done better? You've got no idea, because they lie all the time. They've lied all the way through. The Chinese have lied from day one of this whole viral case. In fact, the reason we are dealing with coronavirus today as a problem in our society is because the Chinese lied and covered it up from the beginning in December and January. Had they not done so, all of us would have been in a much better state. That doesn't excuse mistakes made by our own governments, of course, but it does point to the reality that we've got no idea what goes on in these countries. We have no idea if the stats that have come out of China are accurate or not. How can it possibly be the case that only 3,000 people have died in China, a country of over 1 billion people, where for a month the virus was running unchecked? Do me a favor, if you believe that. We know that China lies about its GDP statistics and other matters as well. So anyone who wants to believe an authoritarian state's propaganda is starting off from an impossible position, which is they're just believing lies. So if you want to go down that route, that's fine. Now, that doesn't, of course, alter the fact that you can take lessons from how authoritarian states look at some of the issues as well. It seems to me that we, as we're plotting our way out of lockdown, can look at measures undertaken in various parts of the world to go and see, well, actually, that seems to work well. That can't work in our society because it is an unacceptable level of surveillance, for example. We're not going to start, CCTVing everything and making you have to comply with, government intrusion on all your activities. But you can still take lessons from that going forwards. And I think, we've got what countries, democratic countries, need to do is point out the flaws in what authoritarian states have done, how they've conducted themselves. Can, of course, point to successes and adopt those, but also, crucially, adopt their own methods and methodologies that are suitable for liberal democratic societies like our own. I think in one case, it's a mistake to think too much about what the other side as such is doing. What's more important is to focus on what you are doing and how you can chart a way out in the way that our societies can best adapt to new surroundings without surrendering our previous liberties and rights and norms. And I think to take some of the talk about, obviously, looking at what's been happening within our societies with fake news, disinformation spread like that, look, I'm in entire agreement that we've been far too open to the dangers of this. We haven't acted in the past on some of the threats coming from authoritarian regimes who want to push a line, a story that furthers their strategic goals and damages ours. And we should be much tougher at calling out what we're seeing, not only in terms of the social media disinformation, calling a lie for a lie and pushing back on it, but also turning the tables and pointing out the flaws in what other countries are doing. And this will doubtless be a controversial statement to make, but what President Trump is now saying about China is absolutely right and correct. It is correct that the spotlight should be thrown very much on China's behavior in this crisis, because the only way you're going to be able to push back against disinformation coming this way is not simply to hold it back there, but to push back the line and look at the truth of what emerged at the start of this. If we are too embarrassed or ashamed of putting that line out, what hope do we have actually of fighting the lies that are coming out from authoritarian regimes? What hope can we have of steering the conversation in a way that reflects what's actually happening rather than what others are doing? So I do think a lot of this comes to how we ourselves comport ourselves and how we act going forwards. And again, to go back to where I started from, there'll always be people in our societies, including some of our leaders, who will want to take lessons from authoritarian states, but we should be very skeptical of what those lessons are and call into question the motives of those doing that.
Thank you. I'll ask one more question. I could go on for hours with you guys, but Edith, if I can sort of maybe build up on what has been said already. One of the things that seems to keep a democracy intact is trust. And as actually Francis Fukuyama, I think, recently wrote an op-ed about this trust in these institutions, trust in common shared values, trust in basically the system. Is there a real danger that trust is eroding? You mentioned earlier on the scapegoating of the European Union, but is there widely more a danger that basically civil society will lose entirely trust in the current political systems that we all built over the past years?
Well, thank you for getting back to this. I think it's crucial, and I really believe that it's crucial, in particular when it comes to Central and Eastern Europe, because of those public attitudes that I just mentioned. But following up on what just Corina said about the third wave of democratization, and I could not agree more that I think the main challenge that we face here is that we have been undergoing a global democratic recession even before the pandemic has started. And this is also not something that prevailed after 2010 with Viktor Orban or Jaroslav Kaczynski or Donald Trump. We have to bear in mind that, as it has been said, the end of the World War triggered a wave of democratization, and at the same time there was a huge wave of hybridization, a huge number of hybrid regimes inhabiting gray zone between democracy and close autocracy has been increased constantly since the end of the 80s. And this particular crisis, coronavirus, has been exploiting this, and the risk has been that was posed is that governments like the Polish and the Hungarian government have been using it as a sort of a pretext to rewrite the rules again in order to create an uneven political playing field for their benefit. So in Hungary, we have seen that special legal order has been introduced to grab further power and to weaken municipalities, local municipalities, and the Polish government displaying a constitutional hardball right now to get Andrzej Duda re-elected as soon as possible. And what's problematic in this matter is that these governments are very successfully riding the wave of impatience with liberal constraints on governments. So they are depicting checks and balances and democratic liberal values as sort of obstacles of getting things done for the people. So this is how they're positioning themselves, and this is how they're justifying their sort of system transforming efforts, and this is how they're justifying crisis management efforts. And the particular risk here is that the citizens are more likely to tolerate sort of authoritarian measures because they're feeling that their safety is at risk. And at the end of the day, these decisions are easier sort of remaining in force because simply it becomes part of the political culture and societies are becoming tolerable with that. And this is why it is very dangerous to embed this sort of global pandemic crisis into a false dichotomy that stipulates that people would need to choose between liberal values and not liberal democratic values, and liberal democracy and their safety and health and democracy. So rather on the contrary, we would need to frame our arguments that rule of law and human rights, and these are the most important things to help us to best coordinate in this global crisis. And most importantly, the European Union has to keep an eye on the implementation of this sort of special legal like regulations and rules at the end of the day, because it remains to be seen how long it's going to stay with us.
Thank you very much, Edith. Again, I have personally a dozen questions going on, but I want to give the opportunity to our audience to also ask questions. Julie, I'll give it back to you.
Thank you, Simone. So we'll have 20 minutes or so for the questions from the audience. As a reminder, questions can be sent either through email at paris@ajc.org or through the chat on Zoom. Maybe the first question would be for Daniel. So it is a question linked to what has been said already on globalization and the non-democratic temptation. There is this pattern that democracies, whether some democracies in Europe, Singapore, Israel, are actually dealing better with the crisis than others, than totalitarian regimes. So how can we put that into more light? How can we expose this to the European people, given that also at the same time there is distrust vis-a-vis liberalism?
Well, I think we are very good at with $1 million questions today. I mean, I just want to bring something back to what Corinna said earlier, and that is the issue of trust in systems and societies. How it is very hard to make people trust in the system and the societies that we have right now if they do not even have trust in a better future. If you look at all the indices, people are getting more and more pessimistic about the world. And that's something that's perpetuated by the constant stream of negative information. If we then also have the negative information that's coming from the outside, especially now in times of Corona, we have a major problem. Yes, countries like Germany have fared better in two ways. Number one, containing the virus, and the other one, upholding the democratic institutions, which I would underline are the best vaccine against the problems. I mean, if you look at what a couple of the German state governments tried to do, the local constitutional court or the federal constitutional court stepped in and said, nope, that's not what you're going to do. This is against our value system, against our rules. Bring that together. So the resilience of the democratic system with the resilience against the virus, it should be a no-brainer that more liberal societies fare better. The problem is, liberal societies do not usually pound on their own chest and say, oh, see how great we have done. This is something that the autocrats are usually a lot better at. So I think the first and foremost thing, and that's a general statement that we should do, is be a bit more proud of what we have, a bit more outgoing and looking at what we have achieved, both as societies and in crises, and bring that forward and work together on that. But again, it has been said in the beginning, if we are in a situation where the Italians are now blaming the Germans for not helping them, where the French are closing the borders, and the Russians and the Chinese are standing at the outline of the field saying, well, told you so, autocratic regimes fare better, then we have a problem. So a little bit more pride in what we've achieved and also what we can achieve together, remembering that we only can achieve something if we collaborate, that would indeed help. But this is also something maybe, again, talking about the European Union, where the European Union as such could get a little bit better at. And just want to remind you of the Monty Python sketch, what has Rome ever done for us? They're very neat examples for that, also with the European Union or Obama for that matter, in the Corona times. So looking at that and remembering what we have achieved compared to what the others have achieved, I think that would be a very good first step.
Thank you. Our next question is, do we have the tools to distinguish between measures rightly taken by governments to contain the virus and those measures that violate civil liberties? Is there a benchmark or litmus test that could easily be used? So I don't know who would like to respond to this question. Maybe Alan?
I'm happy to have a crack at that. I think the answer is yes. There are obvious safeguards built into our systems that apply in this context as much as they do to ordinary contexts. Now, obviously, this is a very unique time. Governments needed to act quickly. They needed to push legislation through. But it would seem to me there are two obvious tests when it comes to the legislative angle in terms of what governments are doing. And the first is simply, is this designed to be a temporary measure, i.e. it comes up for discussion again in a few months, or is it something that has been given quite a long lead time, like 2 years? But we all know this isn't going to last 2 years in the way it is now. And if we're still in the same position in 2 years' time we are now, we're finished as societies anyway. So, what we're moving towards is a process of living with the virus. Living with the virus will have very different restrictions to what we've currently seen thus far, and will be lesser restrictions. So the point is, if a government has put in measures that are intended to last for a long time with no break in them, that to me is already suspicious. Secondly, have the opposition been allowed the opportunity to scrutinise, or not even the opposition, members of the political parties in turn, have they been allowed to scrutinise it, or will they be allowed to scrutinise it going forwards? If that process is occurring, and if votes have to happen on it, then again, I think you can say we're keeping in line with our parliamentary democracies, even if these are unusual times and we've sort of squashed certain liberties. And I think that's the benchmark. And then you can move into other areas, of course, which is, are the press able to freely report on what's going on? Can issues be raised by ordinary citizens on social media? And again, if those have been clamped down on, in a very suspicious manner by people claiming that this is against state security or something like that, I think you have your self-evident answer. So once more, I do believe it's a pretty simple line to see. Are things permanent? Are things allowed to be discussed? Are they able to be publicized? If the answer is no to any of those, then I think you have a case for suspicion as to what's been going on.
Thank you. Our next question is for Corina. Since the internet and social media are the privileged ground for these actors seeking to influence public opinion, and since the problem is transnational, don't we need clearer and stricter international rules online?
The short answer, thank you for the question. The short answer is yes, but what kind of rules and who's to enforce them? And again, this is not a new conversation. I think we started looking at what can be done on the internet to manipulate public opinion in 2016 with the massive influence operation during the US elections. And I think what that has done is to open a window into the lack of regulation and the lack of transparency of how we operate online. And I'm not just talking about individual users, I'm talking about social media companies, technology companies, marketing companies, political marketing companies, political campaign, and this opens an entire range of issues. That's why I think we need to look at the ecosystem. Just regulating speech online or what can be published, it's not going to do the trick. We have to look at the incentive system and the business model. We have to look at how transparent we are about spending money on political campaigns and how we conduct political campaigns, who's getting hired to do what online. And again, this was the issue with the US elections, but it was the issue with the elections in the Philippines, for instance, and all over the world. And so there's a depth of issues where our regulations and our policies have not caught up to the realities of what is happening online, and how our shift to sort of the virtual world has transformed a lot of the democratic processes. So in that sense, we do need to have that conversation, and we do need to bring our policies and our regulations close to where the world is going. But there is a fine line between doing that, so dealing with the mechanisms of amplification and the spread of information, and dealing with content itself, which is different. And there are rules for that too. The problem is who is going to exercise the oversight and in which way.
Thank you. We will continue with the question for Daniel. The socio-economic fallout will certainly be quite important for all of our countries. It is already quite apparent that we will be dealing with a recession for this year, possibly going into 2021, and who knows then. In terms of the political implication at the moment, it seems like some of the more populist parties like the AfD in Germany or the National Front in France are not doing necessarily better than others. How do you see this play out in the future? And is there a danger that we will see populist or even radical actors emerge?
Yeah, There actually have been very interesting opinion polls being done about populist parties, right-wing and left-wing parties in the crisis. And then interesting to see is if they are in government, they are quite stable in the opinion in the opinion polls, but so are the governing parties in most countries. Where they are not in government, they have been facing a downturn, and this can indeed be an opportunity to fight the claims that have been made, to fight the attractiveness that they have. The problem there is just, this is only possible if the democratic forces are able to find proper suitable answers. And then coming back to the core of the question, the socioeconomic fallout will be severe. I mean, look at the unemployment and that's surging at the moment. Not only the actual unemployment, there are also systems in place where the state in Europe pays a certain fraction of the salary so people can stay employed. So whilst those people are not appearing in the official unemployment stats, these are some 10 million people in Germany alone. So this will have tremendous implications on people who work in small medium enterprises, people who own small medium enterprises. And if they feel that they have not been helped properly in those crises, these people will turn to those who promise them simple answers. If your livelihood is on the line, not only your life like is in Corona times, but if your livelihood is on the line and there are no proper answers, people will tend to fall for the simple solutions that are being offered by the populists. And then we run into a serious problem. We have seen that during the crisis, we have seen that during the Brexit debate, how more populist forces have gained traction, and this will be a situation on speed if we do not find proper answers. How can these answers look like? Well, indeed, this is something where we have to look at the European perspective, but there's again another danger, and this is that the economic strong countries will remain strong because they can pump billions and billions in their economies, while the other countries that cannot do that, they will suffer, both in terms of economic but also political weight. And this will again fuel the system of populist surgeons that the populists are getting stronger and stronger. So indeed, if we do not act as democratic forces, if you do not find European answers to that, at least in the EU context, the socio-economic fallout will indeed benefit the anti-democratic parties, and that's a very, very valid concern.
Thank you. We now have a question from Dallas Kennedy. Have globalization and deference to multilateral institutions helped to strengthen democracy within each country or not? So who would like to answer that question? Maybe Corina?
Sure. It's historically, I think the answer is yes. And I'm not sure what timeline Dallas is referring to here. I think it's too early to tell whether turning to our multilateral institutions or supranational bodies is changing how we're dealing with the crisis now, or how we're dealing with the variety of crises that are going to spin off of this in the future. But I think traditionally, if we look at Europe, of course, all countries and particularly newer members of the EU, but also countries that are on the fringes of the EU and aspiring to become EU members, have benefited from globalization, have benefited from the model that the European Union has promoted, both in terms of economic development and democratic development. And you know, if I could express a hope here, I would like to see that model continue to be attractive and continue to be able to promote and trigger change in these countries. I think this is what is at question now. And this is where I think a lot of the turmoil is happening in the transatlantic space, because we are seeing in Central and Eastern Europe and the countries that have become members of the EU most recently, this backsliding of democratic standards and institutions. And they used to be a role model of the possibility of EU and NATO enlargement for other countries in the adjacent regions. And I'm not sure that we've done enough to maintain the solidity of that model of integration, Europeanization, and democratization. So I don't know what the future will bring, but this is something for sure that we need to consider. And it has worked in the past, but we're not sure that it's going to work in the near future or even in the long term.
Thank you, Karina. We have time for one more question. We have a question from David Harris, the CEO of AJC. Do you see any pattern in Europe, for example, between countries viewed as responding more effectively to the pandemic, Austria, Germany, Denmark, Greece, etc., and those views are as responding perhaps less effectively and with higher casualty rates, Italy, Spain, UK, France? Daniel, would you like to answer this?
I think, and that's Alan that hinted to that earlier, numbers are very deceiving, which has a lot to do, if you look, for instance, at Germany, how the pandemic started there, it was spread mostly by young people. Coming from Ischgl, going back to Germany, celebrating Carnival. And so the age group was significantly younger than, for instance, in Italy, where the age group of the people with the infection was, the age was significantly higher. So I would be very careful looking only at those numbers. But again, and maybe Alan is better suited to answer that than me, but generally what helps are two things. Number one is institutional resilience, and the other thing that helps, and that might be hard for Americans to understand, a proper healthcare system that actually works and builds capacities in the long run.
Thank you very much, everybody. I think we are running out of time, unfortunately. I'm sure we will be having this conversation again. This is obviously a topic that is not going to go away and will only become more important. Again, AJC has been, of course, in the past and will continue to be invested in the advance of democratic values. So this is an issue we'll be dealing with as an organization for now and more so in the future. Julie, I leave you with the concluding words, and thank you very much for the panelists.
On behalf of AJC, thank you to our distinguished panelists for such a timely and insightful discussion. Please stay tuned with AJC. Our next event will be later today at 12 p.m. Eastern Time or 6 p.m. in Europe on UAE and the coronavirus. For more information, please visit our social media or ajc.org. Please stay safe and healthy. We are looking forward to seeing you again soon on our programs.